At 2:41 in the morning, every fountain inside Red Mirage Estates stopped at the exact same second. The golf course sprinklers died mid-spin, their aluminum arms freezing in place like rusted weather vanes that had simply given up. Mansion showers coughed air. Bathroom faucets let out one long wheeze and then nothing. No dripping, no trickle, just silence where water used to be. Then the screaming started, not one voice, but many, cascading out of lit windows and open garage doors. The kind of panicked noise that a certain class of people reserves for situations that money is supposed to prevent. Elias Boone stood outside his old desert pump house holding a kerosene lantern when the first wave of luxury SUVs came flying down the canyon road toward the underground reservoir station. Their headlights swept across dry creosote brush and pale caliche soil, cutting wild yellow arcs into the dark. He watched them come without moving. He had been awake already. The way a man gets when he lives alone long enough that sleep becomes optional and the desert at night becomes the only conversation worth having. Victoria Hale jumped out first, wearing silk pajamas the color of expensive champagne and fury all over her face, the kind of fury that had always gotten her what she wanted, because it had never once been challenged at the root. She crossed the gravel in bare feet without seeming to notice the rocks. 3 other homeowners stumbled out behind her half-dressed phones in hand flashlights cutting in every direction. A county engineer named Dale Sutherland had arrived moments earlier, summoned by an automated alert from the water management system. He stood near the pump house door with a clipboard and the patient expression of a man who had seen this particular variety of chaos before. Victoria pointed at Elias with one manicured finger. "Turn the water back on now," she said, and her voice had the sharp edge of someone who believed command was a birthright. Elias looked at her the way a man looks at weather, noting it, not afraid of it. Dale Sutherland cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to need to ask you something before we talk about turning anything back on." Victoria turned to him. Dale did not flinch. "Who told your HOA this water belonged to you?" The question landed like a stone dropped into a dry well. Victoria's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Elias Boone set the lantern down on a flat rock and put his hands in his jacket pockets. "That water was never yours," he said. It was the first thing he had said all night, and he did not raise his voice to say it. Victoria Hale had not driven 40 minutes out of Scottsdale at 3 in the morning to be spoken to like that by a man in worn work boots standing in front of an old pump house with a peeling painted sign that read, "Boone Desert Preserve, no trespassing." But the county engineer was nodding in agreement, and the automated drought protection system that had triggered the shutoff at 2:41 was not her system, had never been her system, and operated under parameters written into Arizona water law decades before Red Mirage Estates existed as anything more than a sketch on a developer's napkin. She didn't understand yet, not fully. She understood that the water was off. She understood that Elias Boone stood between her and the water. What she did not yet understand was the depth of the ground she was standing on, or how long that ground had belonged to someone else, or what it actually meant to inherit 2,700 acres of desert alongside the only reliable aquifer within 60 miles. That understanding was coming. It would arrive slowly, the way consequences always do when powerful people have spent too long confusing access with ownership. Elias Boone had not always lived alone on that land. There had been a woman named Margaret who made strong coffee and laughed at his bad jokes and understood without needing to be told that some places on Earth carry a particular kind of weight. She had been gone 4 years now. Cancer the fast kind, which at least had the mercy of not dragging, and the ranch had grown quieter in a way that Elias had made his peace with more or less. He rose at 5 each morning, fed the cattle before sunrise, walked the fence line in the long amber light, and spent his evenings in a kitchen chair with a cup of coffee he didn't need, and the particular silence of a man who has outlived the people who gave his life its loudest sounds. Margaret's cup still sat on the shelf above the coffee maker. He had never moved it. He didn't think he would. The land itself was older than his grief, older than his memory of it, older even than the family stories that came down through his grandfather's generation about what it meant to survive in the Sonoran Desert before air conditioning and bottled water and grocery stores that stocked mangoes in January. His grandfather, Chester Boone, had come to that stretch of desert in the late 1940s as a young man with a surveying background, a stubbornness that bordered on theological conviction, and just enough money to file a land claim before anyone else thought the parched ground was worth filing on. Chester had the quality that certain people develop when they have been genuinely poor. Not dramatically poor, not the kind of poverty that becomes a story to tell later, but the grinding, quiet, everyday kind that teaches you that things only stay yours if you understand exactly what it means for them to be yours, and you protect that understanding with every tool available to you. He had come to the Sonoran Desert partly because land was cheap, and partly because he had read a geological survey that mentioned subsurface water indicators in a range of hills that most people were still writing off as worthless. Chester Boone had a habit of reading things that other people set aside. He had a habit of believing numbers over impressions. He had a habit of filing things correctly. Chester had sunk test wells in 1952, guided partly by intuition, partly by a geological survey he'd borrowed from a state university professor, and partly by the kind of luck that visits men who are paying extremely close attention. The well he found at a depth of 280 feet fed into an underground aquifer of remarkable size and pressure, what geologists would later describe in their characteristically understated way as a significant subsurface water resource. Chester Boone called it something simpler. He called it survival. Arizona had endured 3 major drought cycles between 1950 and 1980, each one drying up surface water, killing livestock, driving smaller operations off the land in quiet defeat. The Boone property survived each one. More than survived, it provided. Chester had negotiated formal water-sharing agreements with 3 neighboring ranches and the small township of Caldera Wells during the drought of 1964, drawing up contracts at a kitchen table with a county attorney and 2 witnesses documenting every gallon with the precision of a man who understood that the only thing more valuable than water was paperwork proving you controlled it. He had charged nothing for the water he shared during that drought. He had charged nothing because he believed and said plainly to the men who sat across his kitchen table that a community that survived a drought together was worth more than the money he could have extracted from their desperation. But he had documented every arrangement with the care of a man who did not confuse generosity with carelessness. Those contracts had never expired. Elias knew where every copy was filed. He had known since he was 12 years old. Chester had showed him, the same way Chester had showed him the well and the pump and the aquifer depth gauge, not as inheritance, but as instruction. This is what you have. This is how you keep it. This is why it matters. He had grown up hearing those stories not as family mythology, but as operational instruction. His father had told him, learn the land, learn the law, and never confuse the two. The land would outlast you. The law, if you used it right, would outlast everyone who tried to take the land. Elias had taken that lesson to heart in the way that quiet men do not by speaking about it often, but by acting on it completely. The Boone Desert Preserve had grown under his management to include the original homestead, the reservoir, the pump infrastructure, nearly a mile of irrigation channels and grazing land that supported a modest but sustainable cattle operation. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of wealth that attracted attention or envy in obvious ways. It was the kind of wealth that sat underground patient and enormous waitings. Red Mirage Estates had appeared on the eastern edge of his property like a mirage, does suddenly, completely, as if it had always been there, and he had simply not looked in that direction before. In reality, it had taken 3 years to build a luxury resort and residential development backed by outside capital and marketed to wealthy Arizonans who wanted the aesthetic of the desert without the inconvenience of actually living in one. The brochures showed infinity pools reflecting sunset colors. The renderings showed golf greens that would require approximately the same amount of water per month as a small agricultural operation. Elias had watched the construction from a distance and said nothing. He was not a man who objected to things before they required objection. The first time he met Victoria Hale, she arrived at his ranch in a Range Rover the color of slate, and stepped out with the confident ease of someone accustomed to entering rooms where their opinion was the most important one. She was polished in the way that certain people are polished, not just well-dressed, but professionally curated, every detail contributing to an impression of authority that had been carefully constructed and relentlessly maintained. She introduced herself as the HOA board president and the community development director of Red Mirage Estates, which meant, as far as Elias could tell, that she was the person who had decided how things were going to go and was now informing the surrounding world of that decision. She spoke about shared infrastructure with the fluency of someone who had used the phrase so often it had stopped meaning anything specific. She talked about community access with the warmth of a person offering a gift rather than requesting a concession. Elias let her finish. Then he said simply and without emotion, "There's nothing shared about Boone Reservoir." Victoria had smiled at that, the patient smile of someone who believes that resistance is a temporary condition curable by repetition. She thanked him for his time. She drove back down the canyon road. Elias watched her go and then went back to checking the fence line. The HOA's campaign escalated incrementally the way these things do when the people running them have resources and patience and have convinced themselves that they are acting in good faith. Letters arrived on formal stationery from the Red Mirage Community Association citing noise ordinances that did not technically apply to agricultural operations and requesting that Elias relocate his cattle away from the development's western boundary because of odor concerns. He filed the letters in a folder marked Red Mirage, and said nothing. A second round of letters referenced property values and the visual impact of working ranch infrastructure, specifically the windmill at the northwest corner of the Boone property, which had been there since 1958 and was visible from the back patios of 3 Red Mirage villas. Elias filed those, too. A HOA representative attended a county planning meeting and suggested with carefully chosen language that the Boone property's classification as an agricultural preserve was perhaps outdated and worthy of review. Elias attended the same meeting and said nothing, but he had a conversation afterward with the county assessor that lasted 20 minutes and resulted in no change to his property's classification whatsoever. Then, in the early spring of that year, a survey crew appeared at the eastern edge of his land with equipment and clipboards and the slightly sheepish body language of people who have been hired to do something they suspect is questionable. Elias walked out to meet them and asked to see their work order. The survey company representative, a young man who clearly wished he were somewhere else, showed him a document authorizing survey work in connection with a proposed utility easement application filed by the Red Mirage Community Association. The word easement had a legal weight that Elias recognized immediately. He thanked the young man, told him the survey crew was welcome to work on their side of the property line and not 1 inch past it, and drove directly to the county records office when they were done. What he found there would take time to fully understand and act on, but the direction it pointed was unmistakable. Victoria Hale was not making noise. She was building a case one document at a time in the hope that the Boone family's water would eventually appear on paper to belong to everyone. The morning Elias found the cut lock, he stood at the gate to the pump station access road for a long time without doing anything. The padlock had been replaced with a different one, a newer, heavier model with a laminated tag attached that read Red Mirage Water Authority, authorized access only. The gate itself bore a small metal plate recently screwed in that repeated the same words. It was his gate. It was his access road. The pump station beyond it had been built by his grandfather, maintained by his father, and operated by Elias for the past 22 years. Not once in all that time had anyone asked permission to touch it, because not once in all that time had anyone confused touching it with owning it until now. He photographed everything with his phone, documenting the date and time with the methodical calm of a man who knows that evidence is the only currency that matters when someone has decided to take what isn't theirs. He photographed the tag. He photographed the new plate. He photographed the angle of the cut on his original lock, which had been removed cleanly with bolt cutters and left in the grass beside the gatepost, like a shed skin, a deliberate statement, he thought, rather than a careless one. People who want you to know they were there don't hide the evidence. He called his attorney that morning. Then he called Dale Sutherland at the County Water Authority. Then he drove to the pump station using the secondary access road on the northern edge of the property, the one that did not appear on any of the maps the HOA had apparently been working from, and checked that all his systems were operational. The contractors Victoria had sent were nowhere in evidence, but their presence had left Mark's boot prints in the calichet dust near the main pump housing a new set of electrical connection ports installed on the exterior panel, without authorization, a survey stake driven into the ground 20 feet from the main valve housing, with a small orange flag bearing the Red Mirage logo. He photographed all of it. When he spoke to Dale Sutherland later that afternoon, Dale sighed the sigh of a man who had seen this particular variety of overreach before, usually from developers who had confused their own scale with sovereign authority. "She's trying to establish operational control on paper," Dale said. "If they can show a history of managing and maintaining access, some attorneys will argue that creates a claim." Elias absorbed this. How many attorneys have won that argument against a 1952 water right with a continuous chain of title and 3 decades of documented drought contracts? There was a pause. "Not many," Dale admitted. Elias nodded at the phone. "People like her don't steal land with guns anymore," he said. They steal it with permits." Dale had no answer for that, because it was accurate. The drought data that summer was not subtle. Arizona's State Water Authority had issued 2 consecutive shortage declarations by June, triggering a cascade of mandatory reporting requirements for all large water users in the affected counties. The numbers that came back were in the polite language of government documents concerning. In the frank language of the engineers who compiled them, they were alarming. Red Mirage Estates had increased its water consumption by nearly 40% over the previous year, driven by the completion of the second golf course, the addition of 14 new villa units, and the installation of an expanded fountain system that Victoria had unveiled at a spring homeowner celebration with the kind of ceremonial enthusiasm usually reserved for infrastructure that someone actually owns. The resort's marketing materials that year leaned heavily into the imagery of abundance in the desert water, flowing green grass growing, the fantasy of a place where the rules of the Sonoran climate had been suspended through sheer investment. Meanwhile, the small community of Caldera Wells, 6 miles to the west, was on voluntary water restrictions. The Navarro family, who had been farming alfalfa 3 miles north of the Boone property for 30 years, had lost 2 irrigation wells to dropping water tables. Local ranchers were reducing herd sizes. Feed store owners in Caldera Wells had started keeping a running informal count of the cattle operations that had scaled back. It was not a cheerful list. A woman named Doris, who ran the diner on the main road and had lived in this desert her entire 64 years, told anyone who would listen that she had never in her memory seen the morning sky, that particular shade of white that meant the heat was settling in to stay. The land was telling a story that Red Mirage Estates was choosing deliberately and expensively not to hear. County engineers had been tracking the aquifer levels throughout this period with growing concern. Dale Sutherland told Elias privately in a conversation that took place over coffee at a diner in Caldera Wells, rather than in any official setting, that the internal modeling was unambiguous. Red Mirage's current consumption trajectory, if maintained through a 3rd consecutive drought year, would put the aquifer under stress that could take a generation to recover from. The resort, Dale said quietly enough that the waitress 2 tables over couldn't hear, could not survive the summer without Boone water. Not comfortably, not at current usage levels, not without accessing the primary aquifer that sat under Elias Boone's 2,700 acres and had, by every legal document in existence, been the exclusive property of the Boone family since Chester had filed his water right in the spring of 1952. Elias had always known this. He had known it with increasing clarity as each drought report crossed his desk, as each conversation with Dale Sutherland or the county assessor or his attorney sharpened the picture. What he had not known or had suspected but not confirmed was the full extent of what Victoria Hale knew, and when she had known it. That information came to him in the form of a manila envelope left in his ranch mailbox on a Thursday morning in July by a county employee whose name Elias would not learn until the public hearing, and whose motives he chose not to examine too closely because the documents inside were genuine and the story they told was complete. The records office in Maricopa County kept a remarkable archive. Elias had spent time there before enough to understand its layout and the patience required to navigate it. The long, fluorescent-lit hallways, the smell of old paper and newer microfilm, the particular quiet of a place where history gets stored without sentiment. He had always found it more useful than intimidating. What he found on the visit prompted by the cut lock, and what the documents in the manila envelope confirmed and expanded, painted a picture of the Boone water rights that was both simple and total. The original water right filing from 1952 predated the county's current zoning framework by 15 years, and the state's centralized water authority by nearly a decade. It established Chester Boone and his heirs as the primary rights holders for the aquifer underlying what was now the Boone Desert Preserve, with priority status that, under Arizona water law, superseded all subsequent claims in times of shortage. The temporary access agreements that Red Mirage Estates operated under, agreements that the HOA's own attorneys had apparently buried in the development's founding documents in language so qualified and conditional that most homeowners would have needed a water law specialist to understand what they were actually signing, had been granted by Elias's father as a good faith accommodation during the initial development phase. They were explicitly temporary. They were explicitly subordinate to the Boone family's primary rights. They had never been converted to permanent rights because the applications to do so had been filed and withdrawn twice. Withdrawn, the records showed at moments that coincided with periods when Victoria Hale had apparently calculated that a different approach would serve her better. The filing dates, the withdrawal dates, the gaps between them. It was all there. It had always been there, waiting in a banker's box on a metal shelf in row 14, section C. For anyone who cared enough to look for it. Elias carried photocopies of everything out to his truck in a paper grocery bag and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving home, not because he was surprised by what he'd found, but because there is something particular about seeing the shape of someone else's plan laid out in documents, the cold arithmetic of it, the years it must have taken to build the people who must have looked the other way, that takes a moment to sit with. The twist that sat at the center of all of this, and that Elias turned over in his mind during the long, quiet evenings on his porch that summer, was not complicated. Red Mirage Estates did not own its water supply. It had access to someone else's water supply on terms that the primary owner had never surrendered, and it had built an entire community, hundreds of millions of dollars of real estate, a lifestyle brand, a promise on top of that borrowed access without ever telling the people who bought homes there what the foundation actually was. Victoria Hale had known. She had known because her attorneys had known, because the documents were right there in the county records, because the temporary access agreements bore the signatures of people who had understood exactly what they were signing. She had chosen to proceed anyway. She had chosen to expand anyway. She had chosen to build a second golf course and a fountain system and 14 new villas while the aquifer dropped and the drought warnings accumulated and the county engineers sent internal memos that she apparently read and filed and did not act on. She had been running a race against time, counting on the hope that sheer scale and established presence and political pressure would eventually convert temporary access into something permanent before anyone with standing to object did anything about it. The county insider who left the envelope in Elias's mailbox was, it emerged much later, a junior engineer named Marcus Webb, who had spent 2 years watching internal correspondence about Red Mirage get routed to supervisors and quietly shelved. Marcus was 28 years old, had a degree in civil engineering from the University of Arizona, and had taken the county job because he believed, with the specific earnestness of a young person who has not yet had that earnestness tested by the bureaucratic world, that public infrastructure work mattered, and that the people doing it were on balance trying to do the right thing. The emails the envelope contained showed a pattern that was in the colorless language of administrative documentation, difficult to explain away. He had watched the pattern accumulate for 2 years before deciding to do something about it, and the decision had cost him several nights of sleep and a conversation with his father that he would describe later to a state investigator as the most clarifying conversation of his life. His father had told him, "You took a public job. The public is who you work for." Marcus had nodded. Then he had driven to the Boone property mailbox at 7 in the morning on a Thursday and put the envelope in and driven away without knocking on the door or leaving a return address. Engineers had flagged the aquifer stress projections in writing 4 separate times. Each time, the response from the county's liaison to the Red Mirage development had been a variation of acknowledgement without action, the bureaucratic equivalent of nodding while driving toward a cliff. One email written by a senior hydrologist and addressed to the county water board had used the phrase potential community water security crisis in plain language without abbreviation or bureaucratic cushioning. It had been received, acknowledged, and not forwarded upward. Victoria Hale's name appeared 3 times in the chain, always in the context of conversations about the classification question. The effort to reclassify the Boone aquifer from a private agricultural water source to a shared municipal infrastructure resource. That reclassification, if it had succeeded, would have fundamentally altered the legal landscape. It would have made Elias's primary water right harder to enforce, created ambiguity about who managed the resource, and potentially subjected the aquifer to the kind of regulatory framework that favored established users over original title holders. Victoria had understood from the beginning that the document supported Elias, so she had been working carefully and consistently to change the documents. The HOA town hall that August was held in the Red Mirage Community Center, a building that managed to be simultaneously spectacular and hollow the way things built primarily for the impression they made on visitors tend to be. The chairs were upholstered, the lighting was recessed and warm. A catering table along the far wall held bottled water and sparkling water and infused water in a tall glass pitcher with cucumber slices, which given the circumstances carried an unintentional irony that Elias would have appreciated had he been there in person. Victoria opened the live-streamed meeting with the composed professionalism of someone who had rehearsed every word and anticipated every question. She presented charts showing community amenity value. She discussed infrastructure investment. She used the word commitment 11 times in the first 20 minutes and the word partnership 9 times, and the word future so often that it began to seem less like a time horizon and more like a place she was running toward. The homeowners who filled the curved rows of chairs were wealthy and, for the most part, not accustomed to worrying about things like water. They were accustomed to paying someone else to worry about water, which was a different relationship to the problem entirely. Victoria told them that the community was fully protected, that the water supply was stable, that the HOA was actively working with county partners to ensure long-term resource security. These statements were not technically lies in the way that a sentence can be grammatically accurate while being substantively misleading. Then a homeowner in the 4th row, a retired contractor named Gerald Marsh, who had bought a villa 3 years earlier and had spent enough time on job sites to know what questions to ask, raised his hand and asked the question that undid everything. Does the HOA actually own the water we're using? His voice was not hostile. It was genuinely curious in the way that a person is curious when they suddenly realize they may not know something they assumed they knew. Victoria's composure held for approximately 3 seconds. Then it did something more interesting than breaking. It became more composed, visibly, deliberately, the way a face becomes more composed when it is working very hard to not reveal what is behind it. She said that the water supply arrangements were complex and multi-layered and that there were county partnerships and agreements in place, and she moved on. Gerald Marsh's hand went down. 2 rows back, a woman whispered to her husband. Near the door, 3 homeowners exchanged glances that contained an entire conversation. The meeting continued. Victoria guided it expertly back to safer ground, landscaping decisions, parking regulations, the new walking path along the eastern perimeter. But something had shifted in the room in the space of one unanswered question, the way weight shifts on a structure when one of its hidden load-bearing elements fails. The people who had come in confident left uncertain. The people who had come in uncertain left afraid. And Gerald Marsh, who had come in asking a genuine question, left with the expression of a man who had received in the shape of a non-answer exactly the information he needed. Elias watched the live stream on his laptop at the kitchen table, drinking coffee he didn't need at 9:30 at night with the sound of the desert coming in through the screen door. He watched Victoria navigate the room with a professional skill he could acknowledge without admiring. He watched Gerald Marsh's hand go down with the expression of a man who understands what it looks like when someone knows they've lost a room and is managing the retreat. Outside, his cattle were quiet. The windmill returned in the dark. The aquifer sat 300 feet below his floor, full and cold and patient as it had been since before anyone in that community center was born. State investigator Harold Quinn arrived at the reservoir site on a Tuesday morning without advance notice, which was, for anyone who understood how state drought investigations worked, itself a statement. Quinn was a compact man in his late 50s with a background in hydrology and the manner of someone who had spent a career being the person in the room that other people had hoped would not come. He spent 4 hours at the site with measuring equipment and a photographer. He spoke to Dale Sutherland for the better part of an hour. He drove past the Red Mirage fountains on his way out, slowing to observe them for a moment before continuing down the canyon road. He did not stop at Victoria's office, though she called his mobile number twice while he was still on site. He did not return those calls that day. The emergency public hearing was held at the County Hall of Records in late August in a room designed for planning meetings that was now filled far past its comfortable capacity. People stood along both side walls. A television crew from the Scottsdale affiliate had set up a camera in the back corner without being asked, and no one had stopped them. State Water Authority officials occupied one side of the presentation table. County engineers and their documentation occupied the other. Representatives of agricultural water users, including Elias Boone, sat in the front row of the public gallery. Red Mirage homeowners packed the back half of the room with the anxious energy of people who were beginning to understand that a conversation they should have been part of much earlier had been happening without them. Victoria Hale sat at a separate table with 2 attorneys and the particular stillness of someone conserving energy for the arguments ahead. Her hair was perfect. Her suit was immaculate. Whatever was happening inside her was invisible on the surface, which was a feat Elias could acknowledge sitting 15 feet away without finding it admirable. Harold Quinn opened the state's presentation without preamble or ceremony. His slides were dense with numbers. He spoke for 22 minutes in the measured cadence of a man reading a document he wrote himself, which he was. The findings were comprehensive. Red Mirage Estates, the report concluded, was critically dependent on water accessed through temporary agreements with the Boone Desert Preserve aquifer system. Those agreements, which Quinn displayed on the projection screen in their original language subordinate temporary subject to primary rights holder authorization, had never been converted to permanent rights. The development's current consumption levels were unsustainable under the present drought classification, which had that morning been elevated to the state's highest shortage tier. Agricultural water rights holders under Arizona law held priority status in all shortage scenarios. Quinn paused. He looked out at the room. In practical terms, he said, this means that luxury and non-essential water use is subject to mandatory reduction before agricultural and essential residential use. He said it simply, without drama, the way you say something that has always been true and is only surprising to people who chose not to look at it. The homeowners in the back half of the room began talking to each other in urgent, low voices. Gerald Marsh sat very still with his arms crossed. Victoria's lead attorney leaned toward her and said something inaudible. Quinn turned a page and continued. He displayed the aquifer monitoring data, the consumption trajectory graphs, the correspondence between county engineers and the HOA liaison, including, read aloud in his even voice, the email that had used the phrase, potential community water security crisis, and gone nowhere. He displayed the original 1952 water right documentation. He displayed the chain of title through Chester Boone's estate through Elias's father to Elias himself, unbroken, fully documented, never legally challenged in 73 years. He displayed the temporary access agreements side by side with the permanent rights applications that had been filed, reviewed, and withdrawn. The room by this point was extremely quiet. Then he said the sentence that would be quoted in varying forms in every account of that hearing that came afterward. Mr. Boone owns the reservoir. 5 words spoken at normal volume into a room that went so quiet that the ventilation system became audible. A woman near the back made a sound that was not quite a word. Someone dropped a pen, and the small clatter sounded enormous. Elias sat in the front row with his hands on his knees and said nothing. He had known this for a long time. The room discovering it was a different experience from him knowing it, and he gave the room a moment to absorb what it needed to absorb. One of Victoria's attorneys stood and launched into an objection about procedural notice and the complexity of the legal landscape and the good faith investment that Red Mirage homeowners had made under reasonable assumptions. Quinn listened to all of it with the patience of a man who had a full room behind him and was not going anywhere. Then he said, still calmly, that the hearing was informational in nature, and that the drought protection protocols would be taking effect pursuant to existing law regardless of any pending procedural challenges, and that the state's priority was ensuring that agricultural operations and essential residential water users in the affected area were protected through the current shortage period. The attorney sat down. His second objection never got started. The room came apart after that, not violently, not theatrically, but with the particular energy of a large number of people processing a significant unwanted truth simultaneously. Homeowners stood, voices crossed. Gerald Marsh asked two very precise questions and received two very direct answers. A woman near the window asked what this meant for their property values and was told gently but honestly that it was too early to say. A man in the third row asked whether the temporary access agreements could still be converted to permanent rights and was told yes with the consent of the primary rights holder, which meant in plain language with Elias Boone's agreement. Several heads turned toward Elias. He looked straight ahead. Victoria remained seated, her attorneys flanking her, her composure intact, but different now, thinner maintained by will rather than by confidence. The emergency drought protection measure activated automatically at noon that day. As the state notification had indicated, it would luxury water consumption fountains, golf course, irrigation, pool, heating systems was reduced to minimal maintenance levels. Essential residential use was protected. Agricultural operations retained full priority access. It was not punishment. It was mechanics. The law was doing exactly what Chester Boone had understood it would do when he filed that water right on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1952. Victoria approached Elias as the room was clearing. Her attorneys stayed at the table. She walked to him alone, which took a certain kind of nerve that he acknowledged to himself without softening toward her. She said quietly that she wanted to speak with him in private before he left. He considered this, then nodded. They stepped into the hallway, which was emptier, but not empty. People were still moving through it, and a few stopped and looked before deciding to keep walking. Victoria said the things that she had to say, and Elias listened. And then he said the thing that ended the conversation. "I never wanted your people thirsty. I wanted you to stop pretending my family's water belonged to you." There was nothing for her to answer to that. The facts had already answered it in a room full of people and a county engineer's monotone voice. 2 evenings after the hearing, the news of Victoria's resignation reached the Red Mirage homeowners before the formal announcement did the way these things travel in a contained community, where everyone has each other's numbers, and the HOA email list is the infrastructure of social panic. She stepped down from the board presidency and her development director role, simultaneously citing personal reasons in a statement that was admirably brief and completely uninformative. The construction on the new Northern Villa expansion, which had been paused by the state drought protection order, was formally halted when the development company's primary investor withdrew financing pending review of the water rights situation. The golf course that had consumed a remarkable quantity of water each week went into maintenance mode, its greens browning at the edges in the August heat in a way that somehow looked more honest than all that aggressive irrigated green had ever looked. The fountain system at the entrance to Red Mirage, which had been the visual centerpiece of the development's marketing materials, and the thing Victoria had been most proud of, went still. Water is not decorative, Elias had heard his grandfather say once in a memory that surfaced now from somewhere near the bottom of his childhood. Water is not something you perform. You either have it or you don't, and if you have it, you are careful with it because the desert is always watching. The homeowners of Red Mirage Estates, most of whom had bought their properties in genuine good faith and with genuine investment and genuine love for the beauty of the Sonoran landscape, were not villains in this story. Most of them in the weeks after the hearing began the difficult work of understanding what they actually owned, what they were entitled to, what was temporary, what would require honest negotiation and fair compensation to convert into something durable. Several of them reached out to Elias directly without the mediation of HOA bureaucracy, simply as neighbors. Gerald Marsh stopped by on a Saturday morning with a handshake and the kind of direct question that Elias had always been able to work with. What would a fair, long-term water access agreement look like from your perspective? It was the first honest conversation anyone from Red Mirage had initiated with Elias in the 3 years they had been neighbors, and it lasted 2 hours. And at the end of it, the outlines of something workable were visible to both men. Elias sat on his porch the morning after the hearing and watched the sun come up over the Sonoran Desert with the same quality of attention he had given it his whole life. The sky went from black to the particular deep blue that exists for about 4 minutes before the first orange enters it at the horizon, and then through the full spectrum of the desert dawn, which is a more complex and variable thing than people who have not spent time watching it understand. It is a sky that rewards patience, which may be why the people who live under it long enough tend to develop patience whether they intended to or not. The light came across the land, slowly finding the contours of things, the fold of the arroyo to the east, the flat-topped mesa 3 miles out the Caliche Flats, where his cattle moved in the early morning cool, the windmill, the pump house, the old sign that still said Boone Desert Preserve, in faded paint on weathered wood. The reservoir, 300 feet below the surface, was invisible from here as it had always been. But he knew it was there, the way he knew his own heartbeat, not by looking, but by listening, by knowing the shape of the silence around it. Chester Boone had stood somewhere near this spot in the summer of 1952 and looked at this same desert and believed that what he was doing mattered. He had been right, not in the way that gets celebrated, not in the way that gets written up and photographed and marketed. In the quiet way that wells get dug and water gets shared and families survive droughts and the land continues to hold what it holds without asking for acknowledgement. Not every kind of lasting thing announces its arrival. Some things last precisely because they were never built for announcement. They were built for the long, dry, uncelebrated work of simply being here, year after year, through every drought the desert sends, through every generation that forgets, and every season that tests the memory of those who remember. The contracts Chester had written at a kitchen table were still valid. The water right he had filed with careful, unglamorous diligence was still the controlling document. The ranch was still here, Elias was still here, the cattle were still here, moving in the early light with the unhurried indifference of animals that have no idea their water was ever in question. There is a kind of power that is not about display. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't build fountains at its entrance or name things after itself or hold town halls to reassure people that everything is fine. It sits in county record vaults in the form of old contracts and water right filings with dates in the early 1950s. It runs underground for miles in the form of an aquifer that formed over thousands of years and was claimed by one family because that family was paying attention when paying attention was all it took. It survives droughts because it was built for droughts. It survives developers because it was documented before developers arrived. It survives the particular human tendency to mistake access for ownership, to mistake scale for legitimacy, to mistake confidence for right. It survives because paperwork, when it is correct and complete and properly filed, is not glamorous, but it is permanent, and permanence in the desert is the only currency that the land itself will honor. Elias had not won anything exactly in the sense that a game is won. He had simply retained what had always been his. The distinction mattered to him. He had not outmaneuvered Victoria Hale or beaten the HOA in some competition that deserved a trophy. He had waited while the truth became visible at the speed that truth moves, which is sometimes slower than you want, and always faster than the people working against it prefer. Chester Boone had done the work in 1952. His father had maintained it. Elias had protected it. 3 generations of unglamorous, unannounced, careful attention to the basic question of what was real and what was documented and what the law said. That was the whole story. That was the entire mechanism. It was not exciting. It was not dramatic in the ways that people mean when they call something dramatic. But it was thorough in the way that a well is thorough. You don't see it. You don't think about it. And the day you suddenly need it is the day its whole 70-year history becomes worth every dull minute of its making. Gerald Marsh came by the following Saturday, as he had said he would. They sat on Elias's porch with coffee, and the morning light coming across the desert at a low angle that made the caliche almost white. They talked for 2 hours. Marsh had the particular pragmatism of a man who had built things his whole life and understood that a foundation, once you knew what it was, determined everything built on top of it. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. He took notes on a small pad he'd brought in his shirt pocket. By the end of the conversation, the outline of a legitimate long-term water access agreement was visible, not finished, not finalized, but real in its basic geometry. It would require fair compensation. It would require usage limits tied to drought conditions. It would require transparency that the HOA had previously found inconvenient. None of those terms were unfair. Elias had not asked for anything unreasonable. He had never asked for anything unreasonable. The whole problem from the beginning had been that Victoria Hale had not asked at all. She had simply assumed and then built and then defended the assumption with the machinery of bureaucratic aggression right up until the machinery ran into the one thing that reliably stops it. A document older than the aggression filed by a man who had understood 3 generations ago that the desert rewards patience and punishes shortcuts without exception and without sentiment. Elias Boone picked up his coffee cup, his cup just the one Margaret still on the shelf where it had always been, and went inside to make breakfast. The cattle needed checking. The fence line on the northern boundary had a post that had been leaning since last winter, and he kept putting off resetting it. The pump station needed its monthly inspection. There were things that needed doing, the same things that always needed doing, the things that had needed doing every day for 22 years, and that would need doing tomorrow and the day after that. The desert did not change its requirements based on what had just happened. The work was the work. The water was the water. The land was the land. In the desert, water matters more than money. And paperwork outlives arrogance every single time. Some things you learn from a book, some things you learn from a mistake, and some things, the ones that really stay with you, the ones that settle into the bone, the way cold settles into the desert at night, you learn by watching what happens when someone confuses what they were given with what they own and then waits patiently and completely for the land to explain the difference.